When I was a curate, it was considered a somewhat daring innovation to celebrate this day, the 29th of June, as the feast of St. Peter and St. Paul. This feast was kept in antiquity as the feast of both St. Peter and Paul on this day, the traditional day of their joint martyrdom in the city of Rome. But the prayer book of 1662 simply entitles today St. Peter's Day. Such controversies and sensitivities seem to have mercifully faded away in more recent years. Peter and Paul celebrated together is now the official Anglican choice for today. So today we keep a feast in memory not just of St. Peter, the Galilean fisherman and the first of the apostles to confess Jesus as Messiah. We also remember St. Paul, the sophisticated Greek-speaking Pharisee, dramatically converted to Christ on his way to persecute Christians in Damascus. And the theory is that these two martyrs were the joint founders of the church in Rome. Apart from that, there's a symbolic truth that can be brought out in celebrating them both together on the same day, because we think of two great and two very different servants of Jesus Christ, fittingly, at a time of year when we also think of the Christian ministry. Since ordinations in Advent and in Lent have largely faded away, ordinations at this time of year, Petertide, have become very much the rule, due in large part to the increasing influence of the academic year. As a result, today is often a day upon which newly ordained priests celebrate the Eucharist for the first time, as indeed I did 45 years ago. Back in 1977, it was still simply St. Peter's Day, but taking Peter and Paul together provides a better context in which to consider ministry in a rounded way. Peter and Paul together speak of two different but necessary approaches and emphases needed to those called to ministry and needed by Christians generally. Next Sunday, we will hear how Jesus chose his disciples both to be with him and to be sent out from him to preach. And much the same may be said about the church generally. On the one hand, it is centripetal. It's always drawn inward to Jesus at the centre, always centred upon Jesus. It is drawn to him, and its existence depends upon being united with the Son of the living God. On the other hand, it is centrifugal. It's always sent out from the centre, always reaching out into the world and to the world. It exists to bring Christ's message to all people everywhere. Centripetal and centrifugal, being with Jesus and at the same time being sent out by him as his envoys. So, two inseparable aspects of the church are wonderfully illustrated by Saints Peter and Paul. Perhaps we can see Peter as the one who centers the church on Jesus, who proclaims, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Paul, on the other hand, is the supreme missionary, whose motto is, "Woe is me if I do not preach the gospel." They are complementary figures. And so these two aspects hold the key to the incredible growth of the church in its earliest days. We do, of course, need both approaches. We need the rock-like firmness of faith in Jesus, represented by Peter the Rock, but we also need the flair, the imagination, the willingness to take risks that we see in St. Paul, who was able to take Christianity from Palestine and begin the process whereby it became a world religion. Peter represents the rock of faith which cannot change. Paul represents how that faith can be expressed in new ways as the church moves into different and differing historical epochs and cultures. Peter represents the faith once delivered to the saints. Paul represents the necessary and ongoing teaching of the church, making explicit what was at first implicit as doctrine expands and develops over the centuries to meet changing circumstances. There's always going to be a necessary amount of dialogue, even conflict, as these two approaches coexist in the church. Reading between the lines of the New Testament, we can see that there was conflict between Peter and Paul. And Peter and Paul were two very different people, strong characters, but two very different people in background and temperament. So celebrating Peter and Paul together then speaks volumes of the need to recognize that there is more than one way to be a Christian, that there is more than one style or mode of ministry. Celebrating Peter and Paul together reminds us that Christianity always needs a diversity of approaches. The church made its first startling and enormous leap forward under the leadership of these two very different men. Christians and their leaders today will similarly be called by God to continue to work and struggle, even battle, at the interface between centripetal and centrifugal. The church will always know the struggle involved in having to balance, on the one hand, loyalty to the unchanging core of faith, and the need on the other to reinterpret this core faith afresh in new times and new contexts and new situations. And, like Peter and Paul, we are always, all of us, individuals. We always need to be inspired by the Spirit to become the distinctive individuals we are, offering many different but complementary gifts in the service of the one church and one world. Perhaps the Spirit will be teaching us not to be all boringly the same, but to have the courage to be the very different individuals we all are. Each one with different gifts to offer in the life and mission of the church. Each one called to give their life in the service of the Lord.